You're listening to a Times Higher Education podcast.
Hi there, welcome to News Talks, the Times Higher Education podcast in which we discuss the biggest stories in global higher ed. I'm Miranda Prynne, campus editor, and I will be speaking to Times Higher Education editor-in-chief Chris Havergal about the big story in the UK right now, which is that we are very likely to be welcoming in Andy Burnham as our new Prime Minister within weeks, possibly days now. Hi Chris, thanks for joining me. You're speaking from the comfort of THE's air-conditioned office today, which must be quite a blessing.
It's the place to be if you can survive the commute. Absolutely. No, thanks for having me, Miranda.
So the question we're asking today is, what could the arrival of the former Mayor of Greater Manchester, now Labour MP for Makerfield, into 10 Downing Street mean for higher education? Labour's arrival in government 2 years ago met with cautious optimism from the UK's higher education sector, which had by then endured a few years of fairly hostile rhetoric from the previous Conservative government. And the Labour manifesto actually promised to, I quote, create a secure future for higher education and the opportunities it creates, which I have to say 2 years on is... It's kind of interesting to look back at that because right now the sector looks, frankly, anything but secure. And 2/5 of English universities are expected to record a financial deficit this year, according to the Office for Students. And Labour's stance on higher education does seem to have got less and less sympathetic, I would say, over their 2-year term, with discourse increasingly turning in favour of further education or more vocational training. And there is no sign of financial aid beyond the unfreezing of tuition fees, which was announced in last October's Skills White Paper. Then in recent weeks, we've had the Department for Education starting to hint at some slightly trickier policies, such as introducing minimum entry standards for universities. And then indeed, hours before Starmer's resignation, the department shared a statement saying ministers will unveil plans to crack down on poor quality university courses and shift investment towards youth apprenticeships, which sounds remarkably similar in style and substance to what we had been hearing under the Conservatives. Finally, on the international education front, the government's actions seem to slightly contradict much of what they say. They've set ambitious targets for growing international education exports, but then have put in place policies which reduce incentives for overseas students to study here. And there is, of course, still the looming threat of the international student levy, which is currently due to come into force in 2028. So it's fair to say it's not a terribly pretty picture under Labour so far. I guess the question is, will this change under Burnham? Let's start with what we know about him and what he stands for based on his time in government and as mayor. Chris, can you give us the lowdown on Andy Burnham's politics and what we might surmise from any dealings he's had with higher education so far?
Yeah, he's the king of the north, riding to the rescue of the Labour Party. Whether he's riding to the rescue of universities, time will tell. I mean, it's funny, he presents himself as this sort of outsider taking on the Westminster machine. In many ways, his early career is the sort of typical career politician. Studied at Cambridge, was a special advisor to ministers, MP for a safe seat by the age of 31, cabinet minister at 37. It's worth remembering this is his third tilt at the Labour leadership, lost out in 2010 and 2015. He's seen as something of a chameleon-like figure politically, started as a Blairite, but served under Ed Miliband and then indeed under Jeremy Corbyn in the shadow cabinet. So it's his time as Mayor of Greater Manchester that shapes perceptions of him as this sort of saviour figure for Labour and possibly for the UK. In Manchester, he inherited a project which was already underway, attracting investment to the city, getting infrastructure right. It's been a very successful model, but he certainly picked it up and ran with it. He's proved himself to be a very popular politician, a very effective communicator and a great salesperson for the Manchester vision. It's that success in Manchester, 3 big election victories and a growing economy that Labour MPs hope he'll bring to Westminster, and that's underlined by his victory in Makerfield, which sort of turned the tide on a series of reform gains in by-elections. But being Prime Minister is very different to being Mayor of Manchester. Mayors have limited powers and small budgets. Very different in government, and he's got very little time to prepare for number 10. By all accounts, he could be, in power in little over 10 days from now. The level of scrutiny is going to be very different. The sort of interaction with the public, which is where Burnham really excels as a listener, there's much less chance for that. And there's still an outstanding question over whether he's up for making the hard and unpopular decisions that come with being Prime Minister. But he has a mandate for change and needs to act fast to turn around Labour's fortunes. That could lead to some big changes, but I'm not convinced universities will be top of the pile for those big changes. I mean, I haven't said much about higher education so far. He doesn't really have a really clearly articulated policy for higher education. Again, this is all happening very fast. He was Shadow Education Secretary for a short spell in 2010, 2011, when he opposed the increase in tuition fees and the marketisation of higher education, and did make the case then for putting more emphasis on technical education. As a leadership candidate in 2015, he advocated for replacing tuition fees with a graduate tax. As mayor, his thinking about higher education has become much more place-based, increasingly portraying universities as anchor institutions, drivers of innovation and partners in economic regeneration. And he's worked very closely with Manchester universities, and there's been no doubt that they've been central to the city's success. So it's a combination of all of those themes against marketisation, parity with technical education, but a very place-based agenda that's likely to shape his approach as Prime Minister.
Yeah, as you say, there are a lot of things that he's going to have on his plate, and it's unlikely that higher education will be the highest priority. But there are a few things there, perhaps, for universities to really kind of lean into. Burnham is generally considered more of a populist politician than Starmer. Is that a good or a bad thing for universities in the UK right now?
I don't know whether he's populist or just more popular, but he's certainly got a knack for the slightly more populist form of communication that just in the social media age and the 24-hour news cycle you have to be able to embrace. If you actually think of the last Prime Minister we had who you could arguably describe as a populist, that was Boris Johnson. And for all of Boris Johnson's faults, he was probably the most supportive Prime Minister of recent times for universities. If you think of his rhetoric around being a science superpower, global Britain, which led to sort of attempts to attract more international researchers and students. It's possible that if Andy Burnham wanted to give his leadership a bit more swagger, you could see that he could lean on universities as being part of that message. They are arguably one of the last things that the UK does undeniably very well. And in his first speech as a Labour leadership candidate, he spoke repeatedly about the UK becoming an innovation nation. And you could see that being his version of science superpower. And that could plausibly foster a more supportive policy environment for universities. I think there's no doubt that Andy Burnham genuinely does get the important role and believe the important role that universities play in regional economies. But politics has moved on a lot since the Boris Johnson era. Reform are now a major force in UK politics. There's just 3 years to go into an election. Economic growth is very limited, and that leaves very little room for manoeuvre, whether it's on immigration or whether it's on spending, when the need to put more into the NHS and defence leaves very little room for anything else. Burnham won't just be squeezed on the right, though. The Greens are clearly a threat on the left. Whether that translates to more supportive HE policy remains to be seen. So I think the jury's still out on that one.
Yes, I mean, you say he understands the value of higher education. I'd say most politicians understand the value of higher education until they're faced with the realities of government budgets. But, we shall see. Who are Burnham's allies in the party that he may be likely to bring into the cabinet? Do we know much about that? And might it give us any clues on how HE might fare?
I think the one thing we can probably say with quite a degree of confidence is that there is likely to be a changing of the guard here. If you think of some of the key ministers, certainly in the Department for Education, Bridget Phillipson and Jackie Smith, I think would both be seen as being quite likely to go. And arguably few tears will be shed in the sector for them. As you said, the first couple of years of Labour government have seen perhaps a recognition of the challenges facing universities, but beyond the lifting of the fee cap, few actual solutions for the sector. And as you say, some policies are actively detrimental. Yes, certainly Burnham does have his allies, many of them sort of MPs in the northwest of England alongside him, and people who've supported him advocating for his return to government. Look, I think it would be speculation to say who might end up in one of the jobs with relation to universities. I think actually the most consequential appointment could be someone who's not even an MP, but actually a former Vice Chancellor, and that's James Purnell, who's incoming as his Chief of Staff and was for several years Vice Chancellor of the University of the Arts, London. He's quite an interesting character and could have an important role. He was the architect of the 50% participation target for higher education during the Blair years when he was sort of earlier in his career. And as a Vice Chancellor, he was an advocate for reform of student loans. So it's possible that he might be seen as a natural ally and champion of the sector. But he had a relatively short spell as a Vice Chancellor, not an academic through and through. It's quite hard to predict exactly what impression that leaves you of the higher education sector if, as inevitably is the case as a Vice Chancellor, you spend a lot of your time battling with academics and university professionals. So that's hard to predict, but undoubtedly I suspect Purnell's role could be very important in how universities fare under a Burnham government, not least as Morgan McSweeney, who for a great part of Keir Starmer's premiership was Chief of Staff, was seen as being quite hostile to universities and as being a sort of a block on more supportive policies that could have supported the sector.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that Purnell did have that role in the Blair policy of 50%, but equally, I guess one has to acknowledge that times have changed since then. The context in which we're working has changed. So it doesn't necessarily indicate that he would still support that policy now. That's something that someone could ask him.
Absolutely.
As I've already mentioned, Starmer's government has not been as proactively supportive of higher education as originally hoped and perhaps indicated. But his resignation has also left a lot unresolved. So let's consider the key areas of higher education that may be impacted by Burnham's future policies or priorities. The first obvious one is just higher education's role within the wider UK education system. Where does he stand on that?
So Andy Burnham gave his sort of first speech as a Labour leadership candidate, and one of the key lines from that was talking about ending the days of a school system configured entirely around the university route, as is how he described it, and establishing parity between technical and academic routes. And this has perhaps been the one consistent theme through Burnham's approach to higher education through his career. In Manchester, one of the things we've seen is the creation of the MBAC, the Greater Manchester Baccalaureate, which is a equal and alternative route to A-levels and universities, combining core skills with industry pathways that bring together placements and technical qualifications. So you would expect to see an approach on a national level which brought together some of those themes. That's not necessarily an attack on higher education. It's simply a recognition that university isn't the right route for everybody, that the life chances of those who don't go to university have sometimes been overlooked, and that certainly the finances of the further education sector have been overlooked in recent years. And also, in some ways, that's a continuation of Labour, current Labour policy under Starmer, as we've heard. But the problem is that current policy to date hasn't been particularly effective. For example, higher level apprenticeships clearly would be part of the solution, and many universities play an important role in delivering them, but there simply aren't enough of them to go around. And government policy of late has sometimes been actively detrimental to this, for example, removing funding for master's level apprenticeships. So there's a question about whether Andy Burnham could do anything about that. Working more closely with further education, again, something I'm sure Andy Burnham will want to push. Again, that was something that was in the higher education white paper, but there were few incentives to actually make that happen. And many of the levers and incentives that do exist are, still essentially competitive, getting students in the door. So universities and colleges in Greater Manchester have been more successful than most in collaborating. So I think UK-wide there'll be an expectation for closer working, for new structures which share resources more effectively, and partnerships which lead to more coherent pathways through the education system. Again, the question will be, do we actually see reforms that can support this, that can drive this forward? Does Labour have the political headspace to tackle those sorts of difficult issues?
Yeah, and there are a lot of people within the higher education system who'd absolutely be behind the idea that further education, technical education also need greater backing and need a bit of focus. What you've described, I would say, is another example of this slightly contradictory stance that we've seen from Labour, where they say one thing but don't really appear to back it up with any particularly effective actions, and sometimes even seem to work against what they've said thereafter.
And you see in that because they don't have those solutions, these things tend to get set up as attacks on universities and battles, because as ministers, it's easier to sort of criticise something than actually have a solution. The fact is that if you want higher level skills, if you want higher apprenticeships, you need universities to be part of the solution of delivering them, and they actively are part of that. But that hasn't necessarily translated into a more supportive policy environment.
Yeah, and I know it's one of the great frustrations among many in higher education that these things are always pitted against each other when that's just so entirely unnecessary. The research and innovation agenda, you've mentioned Burnham's Innovation Nation, a nice catchy phrase he's coined there. So clearly he recognises the importance of innovation, but where would he see universities within that? Does that mean that he is likely to lend more support towards higher education research?
Again, I'm sure his starting point is going to be his experience in Manchester, where that city's economic success over the last couple of decades has been driven in significant part by its universities, and in particular by the University of Manchester. There's a big talent pool providing expertise, encouraging firms to relocate to the city, attracting investment, encouraging startups and entrepreneurships, and enhancing the global reputation of a city like Manchester. So that, I'm sure, will be part of it. But the other sort of thread has been an attempt to share that success beyond central Manchester into the post-industrial towns that ring the city. The most notable example is something called Atom Valley, which is a planned advanced manufacturing arc across sites in Bury, Rochdale and Oldham. So the idea here is that while the early stages of innovation might take place in a shiny research building in a city centre, the first steps to independence as companies move into production and manufacturing can take place nearby and can produce good quality, well-paid, skilled jobs locally, rather than what we often see is that, there are good ideas in the UK, but when they scale and when they grow as companies, they go overseas. It also recognises that the challenges facing places like Bury, Rochdale and Oldham, and look, you could transplant those names to many other parts of the country and there'll be towns that have similar challenges. But it recognises those challenges aren't simply skills problems, that you need to be able to attract the businesses that create the jobs where those skills can be put to good use, and that creates the environment where young people can see that as a viable route for their future, then encourages them to follow those pathways. So, again, Burnham is not the sole architect of this model in Manchester, but he's absolutely bought into it. In his speech we've referred to, he talked about putting universities at the heart of local economies. The idea is that you could roll out what we might call Manchesterism across the country. The key question is how easy it is to do that. It's not necessarily a model which you can just straightforwardly lift and apply elsewhere, not least as Manchester is a very attractive, livable place where it's benefiting from decisions around infrastructure and investment that have taken several decades to come to fruition. As we're talking here about a general election being less than 3 years away. What we will certainly see is universities being encouraged more to lean into that innovation agenda, that idea of inclusive growth that spreads the benefits of innovation beyond universities and city centres, but to the communities and the wider regions around them. I think the key question here again is, what does Burnham actually do to make this happen? And it's probably a question of funding here, about whether he is brave enough to move research funding away from the golden triangle of Cambridge, Oxford, London. There's arguments that actually might not be the best thing for the UK as a whole, but if you want a more place-based agenda, that might be something you have to consider. Or indeed, whether you would actively devolve more research funding to metropolitan mayors for them to distribute themselves. That could make a big difference. It could arguably lead to a more place-based research funding strategy where every region plays to its strengths. However, there is also a question about how well placed mayors actually are to take on a pretty important task like distributing research and innovation funding. Often they're relatively inexperienced in their positions, their offices and teams around them are relatively immature structures. The risk is that mayors would all chase after the same shiny thing, like investing in AI businesses and research and trying to make their city the hub for that. And actually different parts of the UK end up in competition with each other, and you lose that sense of a coherent national system. So there are trade-offs involved in all of this. But undoubtedly that sort of innovation, inclusive growth agenda is where I'm sure Burnham will put a lot of priority in terms of universities' attention.
Yes, that makes sense. You mentioned inclusive growth. I've also seen the term good growth thrown around in relation to Burnham and his attitude towards innovation, which I guess feeds into this same idea that the innovation and the economic growth that stems from it is great, but it needs to filter through for everyone to benefit. And this isn't just about setting up shiny new tech companies. You've touched on this with what you've just been talking about, but I'm also interested in the role and impact that he may want to see universities having on their local and regional communities. So you've just mentioned that part of it is going to be this idea of driving innovation and business, but what else could maybe be said of Burnham and his approach on that?
Well, I suppose there's one question that sort of raises for me, which is about the sort of civic role of universities as these sort of anchor institutions, that the term would be used. That sort of brings together the skills agenda we've discussed, the research and innovation agenda we've talked about, but then also add in things like community engagement, cultural contribution, public health. Again, areas where we know Manchester universities are really strong and where you would think that Burnham would want to see similar successes across the UK. So yeah, the question that raises for me is, does that mean that Andy Burnham would have a different attitude to market exit of a university, i.e. a university closing or going bust, to the current administration? The DfE and Starmer has been very clear it won't bail out universities. They're autonomous institutions, they're responsible for their own finances, even though it has always seemed somewhat unlikely that a big anchor institution would actually be allowed to go to the wall, with the economic impact that would have on a region, with the huge loss of jobs that would have. Often, a university being the largest or one of the largest employers in its town or city, especially in those sort of post-industrialized northern cities. It seems even less likely, if we think of what the Burnham agenda will be, it seems even less likely that could actively be contemplated. It doesn't necessarily mean that translates into a clear policy solution, a sort of special administrative regime for universities that some in the sector have called for, that would sort of support universities if they were at risk of collapsing. But it does indicate, all of this, as you bring it together, underlines that if you want to reindustrialize and reskill, universities have to be part of the solution. And so the idea of universities going to the wall is something that Burnham would be, I think, especially if he's got a reputation of being a bit of a people pleaser, it would be something he'd be very reluctant to contemplate.
And I guess also, he is a self-proclaimed socialist and very much believes in the arguments around equity. So he wouldn't want to see a region not being served, because clearly that's going to create sort of regional inequalities, which is the very thing that he is so very vocal in wanting to prevent and improve upon. Another one that's obviously big for universities because their finances are so very heavily tied to it is, of course, the internationalization agenda, in particular international students. Do we know anything about where Burnham might stand on this?
Well, we know that international students have been hugely important to the success of Manchester's universities, and there's little doubt that Andy Burnham can see that and recognises that. I think there's a clear sense he regards they should be treated differently to economic migrants or refugees, and indeed he's previously sort of signed letters in the press criticising restrictive regimes towards international students. Again, the problem here is it comes down to politics and the role of reform, and that limits his room for manoeuvre, I suspect, in terms of serious immigration reform that would support international students. That seems somewhat unlikely as we head towards a general election. I think the one area where universities maybe see an opportunity is in a policy that's already been announced but not yet implemented, and that's, as you referenced, the international student fee levy, taking £925 from every international student fee from 2028 onwards. Some of that money is down to go towards maintenance grants, but not all of it. So universities are very concerned about what's effectively a tax on a key revenue stream for them when they're already very financially challenged. They would certainly like to see it scrapped altogether, and I've no doubt they will use the arrival of a new Prime Minister in Downing Street to try and make that case. If not, if it can't be scrapped, I think they would like to see the full proceeds of that reinvested into higher education. Again, at the moment, they've said some of it will fund maintenance grants, but there's a lot of it still going unaccounted for. I'm not convinced how likely it is that Burnham would scrap the levy altogether. Arguably, Labour want to stop making U-turns. They made far too many of them under Starmer. That was seen as one of their key weaknesses. And at a time when public finances are very constrained, a levy on international student fees could be a welcome source of income for government. But universities arguably will have more of an opportunity to make a case for having more of it reinvested in higher education, especially when, as we've discussed, universities are so key to what Andy Burnham wants to achieve as Prime Minister. Funding them properly has got to be part of the solution.
Of course. And sticking with funding from a slightly different perspective, you've mentioned that Andy Burnham actually argued against tuition fees. What might he therefore make of student loans, given the current state of debate around particularly Plan 2 student loans?
Yeah, look, it's now been at the top of the political agenda for the best part of half a year. And it's no sense that that's an issue that's going to go away. We've got a report out this week from the Treasury Select Committee effectively accusing previous governments of mis-selling student loans and condemning the current government for failing to fix it, and particularly saying that ministers have what they call, to quote, a moral obligation to reverse the 3-year freeze to the repayment threshold imposed in last year's budget. So the case to do something about student loans is very strong, particularly for those with those Plan 2 loans taken out between 2012 and 2023, where borrowers often are accumulating more interest than they're paying off and are finding themselves landed with big debts just as they're trying to get properly started in adult life. So yeah, the case to do something is very strong. Whether Burnham is able to do something about it is another question, not least as doing something about it is very expensive. Probably, again, comes down to politics, and this time not about reform, but if there's a sense that the Greens are a big enough risk to Labour that they need to do something to shore up their traditional base. I'm sure it's an area he will want to look at in office. Again, the question is what form that takes, whether it's about tweaking the repayment terms or a more dramatic gesture, what we might call doing an elbow, referring to Anthony Albanese, the Australian Prime Minister, who before the last Australian election just said he'd wipe a chunk of everybody's student debts. And that's seen as having had certainly a hand in helping Labour get over the line to win the election again in Australia. The latter has, attraction of the sort of signature initiative that Burnham probably likes and would have impact as a pre-election gesture. But again, it does all come down to cost. That would be billions of pounds at a time when there's many other things that money could be spent on.
Yeah, of course, the role of realpolitik and all this stuff cannot be forgotten, and ultimately it's will it win them enough votes? Finally, the big one, funding. Do we think there will be any aid, assistance, branches held out to universities in the next 3 years?
I don't think anyone expects an influx of funding that's going to solve the sector's problems. All the money needs to go on the NHS and defence, basically, and there just isn't any money for anything else, especially when economic growth is pretty negligible. If anything, we could see further cuts. Just this week, we've seen another £50 million cut from the Strategic Priorities Grant, effectively the teaching funding for English universities. And the fact that we've now got a defence investment plan that has a black hole of several £billion in it needing to be filled, to me raises a question about promised increases in research spending, which is due to hit £22.5 billion by the end of the decade. I think it's quite possible you could see that reprofiled to find some extra money for defence, or chunks of that earmarked for sort of turned into defence spending or research spending that can only be used for defence purposes. So again, not that sort of funding that universities would really like to see. So I think there's a big question there. There's also, I suppose, on funding, a question over whether the UK decides to take part in the next European Union research funding framework programme known as FP10. That's something a few years ago when the question was whether we go into Horizon Europe, there was great clamouring from UK universities to be inside that tent. I think it's a bit more of a nuanced debate now, especially as FP10 starts to look a bit more like a vehicle for European competitiveness and strategic autonomy, specifically for members of the EU, which the UK clearly isn't. So again, that would be a decision, and whether then the funding that might have gone towards Horizon Association came back to the higher education sector in any other way, or if that was a chance to siphon it off elsewhere, again, that would remain to be seen.
Yes, and of course that's going to be a mixed blessing, isn't it? Because a huge amount of money does come from Horizon back to UK research. To summarise, how might institutions rally favour with the future Prime Minister, or at least perhaps demonstrate their value and worth in terms of the need for support and perhaps one day even funding?
I'm sure there's a lot of thought being given to this in universities across the country at the moment. I think universities would be well advised not to make out that they are uniquely challenged or, worthy of sort of special pleading in what is an intensely constrained spending environment and a intensely constrained political environment in the run-up to the next general election. I'm not convinced that crisis narrative is going to be helpful for a PM who wants to show that he's delivering change and striking a more upbeat note for the country. I think instead universities need to show that they're willing and active partners to deliver on government missions and that they're vital anchor institutions for regions across the UK. That means showing how they drive regional growth, how they're central to skills agendas, including apprenticeships, modular learning, lifelong learning, and things like that, supporting spin-outs and scale-ups and driving productivity improvements across the economy. As well as that, I think they perhaps need to demonstrate efficiency and reform and show that they're continuing to improve their governance and have discussions around sharing services and consolidation where appropriate. Now, if they can do that and can show a return on that, not simply by reports saying, we've added X billion pounds to the regional economy this year, because I think those numbers just wash over people's heads, but in terms of, concrete improvements made in terms of graduate training, number of businesses supported, the amount of inward investment you've attracted, I think that then, as I say, presents you as a partner for government missions and goals, and can allow for the sort of conversations where government could turn around and say, well, this is what we want you to be doing. How can we support you to do more of it? That's more likely to get a sympathetic earring in a Burnham number 10, I suspect, than just throwing our hands up in the air and saying how terrible everything is.
Yeah, so focus on what can be done rather than what can't be done. And frankly, the crisis narrative hasn't really had much productive impact up till now.
And the problem is, from inside the sector, there clearly is a crisis. You can look at the number of jobs going, the disciplines that are at threat, how regions are being left with sort of cold spots where universities just aren't able to sustain that sort of provision. It's just whether that sort of narrative gets the hearing in government that the sector would like, or actually focusing on what we can do together and then how can you support us to do more of that might lead to a more sympathetic hearing.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Chris. Great to get your take on what may be to come for UK higher ed in the next few years.
Thanks for having me.
And we won't have to wait too long to find out, of course, if these speculations come to be. As you say, Burnham is expected to take over possibly within 10 days. And he will be our 5th Prime Minister in as many years, which is quite a thought. At the risk of sounding ancient, I remember the days when 5 years was the minimum length of time you might expect a Prime Minister to be in power.
Me too.
Anyway, a sign of the times. So that's it for this week. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this week's podcast, please do like, share or subscribe. And you can find many more episodes of News Talks covering stories from all over the world at timeshighereducation.com/podcasts. We'll be back with you in a couple of weeks. Bye-bye.
You're listening to a Times Higher Education podcast.